particularly in modern warfare, you can't do anything without power. We need to make sure that our comm systems, that we could talk to the satellites, our missile defense systems, radar systems, all this stuff needs power. And so that has been what has gotten first the Defense Science Board to say, hey, we have to take energy a lot more seriously and look at alternatives to fossil fuels. And that's then what has led Congress to say, yeah, absolutely. That is why Project Pele has gotten all the funding that it has, is recognizing that nuclear power is probably your best non-fossil fuel solution here.
Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Jeff Waksman for a take two. We had some initial technical difficulties on an exciting podcast about Project Pele. Jeff is the program manager, Strategic Capabilities Office, which sounds suspicious like something out of James Bond, at the Secretary or the Department of Defense. And Jeff leads Project Pele at said department. Jeff, welcome back to the podcast. Again, technical difficulties last week, but we are back stronger than ever. Thank you for making the time.
No, thanks. It's good to be back. And as I was just saying, the lighting's better this time. Doesn't look like I'm staring at the sun. So I think we'll do even better the second time than the first time.
Beautiful, beautiful. So, you came across my radar. I like to check out my potential guests' Twitter feeds with a great quote that I saw. And I have quote tweeted it. And it went something like this: far too many believe that the solution to anti-nuke fear-mongering is fantasizing over ludicrous paper reactor concepts. I disagree. It is only with rigorous analysis, relentless fact-checking, and red teaming that we can bring advanced nuclear reactors from concept to reality. This was really music to my ears, and I think really the sort of service that I attempt to bring to the nuclear community. I do find there's a real siege mentality around having frank, open conversations. Conversations I think are really necessary to prevent us from maybe heading down really far down paths maybe guided by false paradigms. So I appreciated that sentiment. I do feel like we're in a sort of new era now with the incredible social license, the bipartisan support for nuclear, where it's safe to have some of these discussions and not necessarily air the dirty laundry, but again, just have frank discussions about the technologies that we're looking to develop, some of their limitations and what the best paths forward are. So, Jeff, I already feel like a kindred spirit. Yeah, maybe take a moment to reflect on that and further introduce yourself. I know you have a career that extends back beyond the SCO.
Yeah, no worries. And it's SCO because the DoD, we pronounce all acronyms, no matter how many consonants there are in a row. But yeah, that perspective I was sharing has changed over the 6 years I've been running Pele. I started the program in the fall of 2018, so 6 years ago. And when I started, there were significant anti-nuclear forces in the Pentagon and the federal government. And so we were focused on getting past people who just didn't like the word nuclear. And that was really the focus, and that has been a challenge over history. I'm not saying that that's completely gone. It has just diminished significantly. The Advance Act, which was a bill to reform the NRC, just passed the Senate by a vote of 88-2. And nothing passes the Senate 88-2 these days with how partisan most other things are. So what I feel now has actually become more of a challenge than anti-nuke are the people who think nuclear is going to be too easy. And it's not just because I care about being right or being wrong on something. It's that I think that if you think nuclear is going to be easier than it really is, it will lead you to bad policy decisions where you will attempt things that are more likely to fail. And we've been through one nuclear renaissance 20 years ago where almost nothing got built. And I very much want to avoid us having a nuclear renaissance where this happens again, where all the tech companies were saying, hey, we want nuclear to happen, that they 5 years from now decide, we tried nuclear and just didn't deliver, and so we're moving on to the next thing. And so that's really what I'm trying to get is to try to make sure that we're going in a real rigorous way, and that we're going to take advantage of this bipartisan support for nuclear to actually deliver real solutions on a realistic timeline.
Beautiful. I tend to ask multifaceted questions. So the second part of that question was, again, who the hell are you? Describe SCO a little more, and then I'll ask you another question about Pele. But yeah, just give us a bit more background. I understand you used to work in the space area as well.
Yeah. Well, like everyone else, I have imposter syndrome. I don't know why I have this job. So, everyone has that. Famously, Neil Armstrong was once at a party at the White House. And he was like, why do they invite me here? I shouldn't be with all these important people. So if Neil Armstrong could have imposter syndrome, then we all can have it. I did work at NASA for a little while. I've worked in private industry. I worked for IBM. So I have kind of a background of science, but also executive branch. I have also worked for Congress for a little while. So kind of able to bring that different experiences to bear. I often get told, oh, you're building a first of a kind nuclear reactor. It must be really fun to design and build a nuclear reactor. I spend approximately 0 hours a week designing and building a nuclear reactor because we have people a lot smarter than me who do all that work. And so my job as program managers is much different from that, but I just have to know enough to be dangerous to ask the questions that then the smarter people than me can answer. So while I do have a technical background, I have a PhD in physics, I have a master's degree in nuclear engineering. It is definitely not any of my brilliance that has been making this reactor happen. That is people much smarter than me, both at my team at SCO, but also at BWXT. They're major partners. We have Rolls-Royce, Northrop Grumman, other companies helping us out. And then also we rely heavily on the national labs, Idaho National Lab, Argonne National Lab, Pacific Northwest National Lab, et cetera.
So tell me a little more about what SCO is.
Sure. So the nature of the federal government is that we're very bureaucratic, and it's impossible to ever fix the bureaucracy. So what we do from time to time is we create new organizations with less rules that can then go faster. And so that is what SCO is. We were stood up in 2012 by Ash Carter and the Obama administration with the idea of having a rapid prototyping arm within the DoD. So your James Bond reference earlier is apt. We like to view ourselves as the Q branch of the DoD. We only build one of anything, but we can move really, really fast to make prototypes happen. And so that is what SCO does. Ironically, the vast majority of what SCO does, I can't talk about. We are a very secretive organization, and it's a deep irony that by far the most public program we have ever done is the nuclear reactor. And the reason for that is because when you're building nuclear reactors and moving them around the country, you can't, despite what conspiracy theorists might think, you can't actually sneak them around. You have to have public hearings, you have to go through NEPA, you have to do all that stuff. So that forces us to be very public. And in fact, because I'm often the only person from SCO who's on the internet, I periodically just get reached out to by random people on the internet who are like, hey, I want to work with SCO, and you're literally the only person whose contact information I could find. No website, no anything. But trust me, we are involved in a lot of really interesting, cool projects in the Pentagon. They're just unfortunately pretty heavily classified.
It seems somewhat understandable, but yeah, very interesting to hear why the nuclear stuff is more transparent. Okay, so, for the nerds, they know what Project Pele is, but I realize as an interviewer, I've kind of screwed this up. We're, 7 minutes in an episode about Project Pele, and we haven't even discussed what it is. So yeah, fill us in on the background there.
Pele, what it comes out of is that in 2018, in the fall of 2018, Congress put some language in a defense authorization bill asking for a plan to make nuclear power happen, recognizing that energy has gotten more important, it's gotten more complicated, the logistics have gotten more difficult. And then nuclear has advanced a long way from what the Army was doing in the 60s. So they just asked for a plan. But thankfully, the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering at the time recognized that reports are not really that useful. What typically the government does when they get a report is it's like you're in high school again. Are you trying to get an A or are you trying to get a C? And generally, the government tries to get a C. They just try to get through the report. Anything interesting kind of gets pulled out during coordination. And you'll spend 3 years and you'll deliver a pretty mediocre report. So he said, you know what, forget that. Why don't we actually try to design a program and see if we could get it stood up off the ground? So that program was handed to SCO, and I was hired to start it. So when I started, I was handed the name Pele. I didn't come up with the name Pele, but I do like it. In a white paper saying, hey, here's an idea of what a nuclear reactor might look like. And so we spent about 1.5 years formulating that in more detail. So what we ended up with is a system that is essentially, if you think of 20-foot Connex boxes, 20-foot shipping containers like you see everywhere, it is essentially 4 of those. One box is the reactor. The second box is the intermediate heat exchanger. The third box is the power conversion turbine. And then those 3 boxes are all close to each other, connected by piping. And then the 4th box, which is a distance away, is the operating module. That's where the computers are, and that's where the operators will sit. And that system, officially what we say publicly is that the reactor will put out between 1 and 5 megawatts electric of net electrical power. But it's going to be significantly closer to 1 than to 5 is what the system will be. So the program started having funding in 2020. We actually kicked off the design process in literally the last meeting I held in person before COVID shut us down in March of 2020. So we've been proceeding at full pace since then. We have since chosen our winning vendor, which is BWXT. And Where we are now is we are finalizing the last parts of the design. Most of the design is locked in. And so because of that, the parts that are locked in, we've begun ordering the hardware. So we have forged the containment vessel. We have made most of the nuclear fuel. So a lot of the hardware is being made. So this is definitely no longer a paper reactor. And where we're heading to in 2025 is going to be exciting. So in 2025, we will begin to assemble the reactor. So that will begin around February, March is when we'll begin assembling the reactor. We will also finish making the fuel. So we anticipate that the fuel will be completed and shipped to Idaho by the middle of the year. We will also lay the first concrete at the site in Idaho. So even though this is a transportable reactor, the reality is that you need a flat, steady surface that's not going to break when the ground freezes in Idaho. So we have a little hole in the ground there. We're going to fill it with concrete, and we're going to put a simple concrete structure up around it. It will not be a sealed building. There's not going to be HEPA filters on this thing or anything. But the concrete is there to provide additional gamma shielding so that our operators can sit 200 yards away and have no fear of radiation.
So this sounds, I'm imagining this to be true, like the most advanced microreactor project occurring certainly in the U.S. now. We have, and we will talk about the predecessor program, the Army Nuclear Power Program. We got into that a bit with Nick Turan on our microreactor episode. Check the archives. But certainly at this moment, and I think, I don't think this was said with the intention of sounding arrogant, but I think you've said in the past, like, if we can't do it, no one can. And it does sound like, SCO leading this being a Department of Defense mission. Still a lot of regulation there, as you mentioned, in terms of getting approvals and things like that, but a lot of first mover advantages and unique advantages in terms of, for example, already having procured and I think starting to manufacture your fuel. That seems kind of light years ahead, not of the competition because not a commercial venture, right? But just in terms of the field of folks developing microreactors. Go into that in a little more detail.
Yeah. So the reason why we say that if we don't succeed, no one else will. It's not out of arrogance, and certainly it's not me. I'm an idiot. But the reason is some of the things you mentioned. So one is just that we are in a rapid prototyping organization. I'm not trying to do this in the Department of Energy, where it'd be much more bureaucratic. We're also able to leverage a different licensing pathway. I don't have to go through NRC licensing. We're actually using Department of Energy licensing. We also have a lot of money. So we've already been given over $500 million by the federal government, and we are continuing to receive healthy funding. And also because this is the fastest moving advanced reactor project, and it's a very interesting project, we've been able to have our pick of the litter of technical expertise. So we've been able to say, okay, well, we need a materials expert for this material. Who's literally the guy who wrote the ASME code on that? Okay, let's have him help us out. So we have just incredible talent there. And in fact, one of my lessons I've been kind of trying to almost scream from the mountaintop recently is to recognize that microreactors, there are no companies who have microreactor designs. They have microreactor concepts. And as you develop them, there's going to be things that they don't understand that they're going to struggle with, any company. And so having that sort of technical expertise that could come in and check their homework is absolutely critical. You have to red team these designs. You have to provide suggestions and improvements because if you take anyone's advanced reactor design and red team it, you will find mistakes. And it's just absolutely critical to have that oversight. So all those things combined are what has allowed us to move so fast. And I think it is just critical for us to have these nuclear reactors going forward, because now over these last 6 years with this team that we have, we've developed a lot of knowledge. We've developed a lot of know-how and experience. And in the same way that when Rickover built his first reactor, he didn't say, great, we built a reactor. Now let's go get a different vendor to build us a different reactor. He said, no, we now have a group of people who know what they're doing. Let's build on that and get enough know-how that we can actually do this efficiently and actually get to that magical nth of a kind world where we're actually able to do this efficiently and cheaply.
I mean, I really do feel like there's a modern bias towards the virtual world. I mean, our interactions, our lives are intermediated, by instance, by this, Zoom call, by our phones. And there's so much less of actually getting our hands dirty, torquing wrenches, that sort of thing. And that's what Rickover was all about in terms of the paper reactor memo. And I do think, the adagio of our time for reactor developers needs to be, what would Rickover say? And again, we have a great episode on that, once again, with Nick Turon. But that seems to be, a real advantage here. And I was just made aware recently of a technology readiness level scale, which I thought was, hey, that's great to be systematized. I think it's level kind of 1 to 9. And even like the distance between 8 to 9 of, having something that's operating, that's proven commercial, versus, I think that's an 8 versus 9, where it's like economic and it's running really well, is a massive gap. And we've got technologies that, have operated in just like the advanced gas reactor fleet in the UK, I think, where you could say it's kind of an 8 or an 8.5, but those reactors ultimately didn't prove to be as economic as PWR. So, there's a huge sort of valley of death for technologies to move through, and really exciting to hear about a program where you're actually prototyping stuff, like doing some material science, getting things hot, and exposing them to some of the stresses that, will exist in this virtual digital world where everything is fixable. In Rickover's case, I guess with a slide rule, and in our case now with some more fancy animations, PowerPoint slides, whatever it is. It's an interesting time.
Yeah, no, technology readiness level is a really useful thing. I'm pretty sure that was actually pioneered by NASA in the early 1960s. And if anyone's trying to build anything engineering wise, if you don't know what that is, you definitely should go just Google it or Wikipedia and learn what TRL is. But TRL is also critical because, and where people sometimes don't realize how TRL builds on itself. If I have a system with 10 parts and 9 of the parts are TRL 8, but one of the things is TRL 4, and that TRL thing has to work, my whole system's TRL 4. Because if that doesn't work and I have to redesign that, I might have to redesign everything else. And so understanding how those different parts go together is critical. To your point about computers versus real, I like to bring up the story about when I was visiting the company that is doing the engines for the SOS rocket. So for those who don't know, the SOS rocket, the big rocket that NASA's building, is using the same main engines that the space shuttle used. In fact, the first few launches, they're just reusing old space shuttle engines that were in storage. And these space shuttle main engines flew, the space shuttle flew 135 times. They obviously worked, but they go, okay, it's the 21st century. We're going to put this whole design into 3D CAD, and we're going to have the whole NASA design, not on paper, but in this big 3D computer. And what they realized was that there were 2 parts where one part was supposed to go in the other, but the part that was supposed to go in the other was bigger than what it was supposed to go into. They go, we have a design problem. These parts don't fit. And they go, well, what's the situation here? Because it can't be that the design is wrong, because we know the space shuttle launched. This design has to work. But what they realized was that when the space shuttle main engines were designed in the early 70s, someone had made a design mistake. And one part was just too big to go into what it needed to go to. And they figured out on the floor that they had to basically bash that part in with a mallet and shrink it so it could shove into the part it needed to go to. And they did this hundreds of times, and it worked. But that knowledge, that know-how on the floor, that you have to mash this part in a little bit to fit into the other part, that's never going to be in a textbook. You're never going to get it out of theory. It's never going to come out of modeling. This is just that a million little things that you learn on the floor when you do it repeatedly. And what SpaceX has, the way SpaceX has transformed space and rockets more than anything, is because they make so many rockets that they have people on the floor who have done the same thing hundreds of times, and just have so much of that niche knowledge and that know-how ability that they could do things so much cheaper. And so when we look now to take this to the nuclear world, why is it that AP1000s are so much more expensive to build in the United States, or have been so far, relative to making the same design in China? As well, China has a huge workforce of people who know how to do these big concrete structures, who know how to do these big forgings. We don't even have a company in the United States that could do forgings of the size that was necessary for the AP1000. So we just lack all that skilled workforce. So, we often get asked, well, what sort of workforce do you need to build for nuclear to happen? It's not really nuclear engineers. Nuclear engineers are a small part of reactors. It's, do you have people who can do nuclear grade welding? Do you have people who know how to, do milling and lathing to the skills that's necessary here? Do you understand the material science? That's the stuff that we have to build. We are trying to build to some extent on Pele, but we definitely have a long way to go.
Right. It's interesting, the nuclear to rocket comparison. I think it's a very attractive one because, the industry or certain participants, a lot of new arrivals from say the tech side, are looking at SpaceX and NASA and saying, hey, can we do something similar in nuclear? Can we disrupt it? Beyond technology readiness level, I was a fly on the wall to a very interesting conversation with a couple friends of mine, and it's actually James Krallenstein who was talking about a Merlin engine in one of these rockets to be 99.9% reliable. In terms of having a trip that doesn't cause a failure. They have individual runtimes of 180 seconds for that engine, so you need probably 50 hours of trip-free reliability out of that engine to arrive at that degree of reliability. But for, say, a reactor coolant pump that needs the reliability of about 90%, on a 2-year mission, that means 160,000 hours. So in terms of engineering the reliability into the parts, like, yes, rocket engines are crazy, really high temperatures, advanced material science, etc. But it gives you a little bit of a sense of why nuclear is such a hard nut to crack. And I think particularly when we start looking in the microreactor space, where because of that sort of fixed cost of operations and maintenance, if you can make a reactor that is as maintenance light as possible and operations light as possible, that goes a long way to working against some of those kind of massive disadvantages and diseconomies of small scale.
Yeah, no, you want to minimize the amount of maintenance you do, but it's also about making sure that the maintenance you do is really easy to do. That's something that a lot of nuclear companies don't think about. This is something, again, to go back to space, that spacecraft companies do think about, right? They think, okay, well, this part's going to break eventually. How do we have an easy way to fix that so I don't have to tear the whole spacecraft apart to fix it? And so this is something that the old light water reactors did have to figure this out, and these new advanced reactors are going to need to figure this out. But we are nowhere near there. Actually, just ironically, my PhD is actually in fusion, not in fission. And this is something when people tell me that fusion is going to be on the grid by 2030, I'm like, well, no one's even thinking about issues like how you're going to do maintenance. And until you do that, you're not going to have anything economical. Part of the reason why nuclear power is so wonderful for the grid is because, at least in the United States, it averages a 93% uptime, which is remarkable, right? That's on 93% a year. But these reactors were not birthed out of the womb from Rickover with 93% uptime rates. Those early reactors were often 50 or 60% uptimes, and it's been over decades of learning that they were able to get those uptimes 93%. And so I'm sure advanced reactors can get there as well, but I sometimes see like new startup companies promising that their reactor, first of a kind, is going to be up 93% of the time. And I go, no way. But Pele is not going to be up 93% of the time either. There's just going to be a lot of stuff that you won't realize until you start to build that's going to create challenges from a reliability perspective. And so the learning can happen, but the learning has to happen. And it gets kind of back to my original message, which is don't sell people on something that you can't deliver. Be honest about the fact that it's going to take till the second of a kind, third of a kind, maybe the fourth of a kind before you really can deliver the reliability and low maintenance costs that you need to have to be cost effective.
Right. And in the case of light water reactors, we're talking 2, 3, 4 decades to hit those 93% capacity factors. That happened just in the early 2000s, really. And looking at deregulated markets and distorted subsidy schemes, nuclear's having a hard enough time surviving with that remarkable capacity factor. If it was stuck in the 50s and 60s, I don't know if there'd be a nuclear reactor running in this country anymore. And when I say this country, we're the 51st state now, according to your president. So.
My wife is a Canadian citizen, so I always tease her. It's Diet Coke America.
I will choose not to be triggered by that comment. Okay, so I do want to really get into the strategic rationale. I don't think we can do that without talking about the strategic rationale of the predecessor, really, to this current thrust with military microreactors or microreactors in general, and that would be the Army Nuclear Power Program. We have talked about it a little bit on this podcast. We've seen reactors, Camp Century famously, buried under an ice sheet in Greenland. We've seen a reactor, I forget the name now, in Antarctica, reactors on kind of mountaintops in Wyoming. And this program ultimately fizzled, right? In the Navy, there's not an alternative to nuclear for running a nuclear sub and being underwater for 3 months. It just simply doesn't exist. And so there's a cost premium that the Navy is willing to pay. Similarly for aircraft carriers. I guess the Army found in the end that premium between the delta between the cost and the operational headache and the human resource consumption, et cetera, of running these reactors in remote places was not worth it, and diesel generators have also gotten a lot better in the last 30 or 40 years. So despite the difficulty of transporting that fuel, ultimately the Army decided, hey, this isn't worth the delta, the difference in cost, so the program fizzled. What is reviving interest? I don't know if you have any reflections on the Army nuclear power program of the past, and sort of what is the strategic case now that you think justifies this kind of investment in R&D?
Yeah, so there's an old saying, which is that in warfare, amateurs study tactics and professionals study logistics. And I was one of those kids who, as a teenager, knew the names of the generals from the Civil War and World War II and whatever, and knew the flanking maneuvers, all this stuff. And when you get older, and when you work in the DoD, you start to realize that in fact none of that stuff really matters, and that what decides modern warfare between near peers is logistics more than anything else. If you study World War I or World War II, they were entirely fights over logistics. The battles took place where the logistical hardpoints were. The World War II was started over oil and Japan's inability to access oil. And warfare is always targeting each other's energy and logistical resources. And the reason why the United States won World War II is not because we had more people or because we had better equipment. We did not have the best tanks or the best planes, but we were able to completely win the logistics battle. We were able to get the oil and the steel and everything else that we needed where needed to go, and our adversaries could not. And so that stayed as a theme in the DoD into the 40s and into the 50s. So, for instance, during World War II, they had a bunch of power ships, and they had ships that could deliver power to shore, because when we did the D-Day invasion, we initially did not have access to the French electric grid, and the way that they were able to power what they did in northern Normandy was they had power ships offshore that would pump in electricity. And those ships were still around, so that when the Korean War happened, for those who know the history of the Korean War, there was a part where the U.S. and the United Nations was pushed all the way down to the bottom of Korea, and we lost access to the Korean electric grid. And the way that we were able to continue to power and operate was that we had power ships offshore of South Korea delivering power to the force. And that is in part what led to the Army nuclear program, which was stood up in the 50s at the same time as the naval nuclear program. And so, in fact, one of those nuclear reactors was put on a boat. The Army had a reactor on a boat, and its most notable thing was that it powered the Panama Canal for a few years. But what happened as we went further into wars like Vietnam is that logistics became not as big of a problem. We didn't have to worry about Vietnamese subs sinking our oil hundreds of miles offshore. And they were in a budget crunch, and they were saying, well, what's the cheapest way to deliver power? And the answer was fossil fuel. And so that was what killed off the Army nuclear program in the early 1970s. And there have been fits and starts on logistics, but generally against the kind of enemies that the United States has had the last few decades, logistics has stopped being a challenge. I bring up the example of the Gulf War, when famously the tanks were making their big left hook, that big tank maneuver to try to keep the Iraqi Republican Guard stuck in Kuwait so we can destroy them piecemeal. And those tanks had to move and not stop. And those big Abrams tanks use 2 gallons per mile, so they need to refuel. And we literally put fuel depots ahead of the tanks, so the tanks could catch up to the fuel depot and refill and just immediately go on their way. I think they were using the 101st Airborne to guard these little fuel depots that were literally ahead of the tanks. And we could do that because we had no respect whatsoever for the Iraqi Air Force or missile program to be able to hit any of this stuff. But as we start to now get ourselves back into the world of great conflict, as we start to think about near-peer adversaries, we suddenly have to think a lot more seriously about our ability to move logistics around. It is no longer even just that we have to fear our oil tankers being taken out hundreds of miles from where they need to go, but we have to even consider our electric grid in the United States, which we didn't have to concern ourselves with in the 1940s. But now we know that, China is living on our electric grid. I mean, if you follow the news about what they're listening to all of our cell phones now, they have access here, and cyber attacks on the grid will be what happens if a great power conflict happens. So we need to think about not just how do we deliver power to the front, but how do we ensure that our critical operations within even the contiguous 48 states can have reliability. And right now in the DoD, all of our reliable power needs are delivered by fossil fuel. It's almost exclusively diesel generator sets. And that's fine, but it's inefficient and it's wasteful, and it assumes that you're going to continue to have a healthy supply of fossil fuels. So as we start to challenge that assumption and realize that, particularly in modern warfare, you can't do anything without power. The world of people with rifles shooting at each other, we are long past that in warfare. So we need to make sure that our comm systems, that we could talk to the satellites, our missile defense systems, radar systems, all this stuff needs power. And so that has been what has gotten first the Defense Science Board to say, hey, we have to take energy a lot more seriously and look at alternatives to fossil fuels. And that's then what has led Congress to say, yeah, absolutely. Bipartisan sense of, yes, we need to find some kind of alternative to fossil fuels. And that is why Project Pele has gotten all the funding that it has, is recognizing that nuclear power really is probably your best non-fossil fuel solution here. Now, nuclear is not going to solve all your problems. You're not going to take a nuclear reactor into a forward, bunker in Afghanistan where it's getting mortar shot at it. That's not a good place for nuclear power. But they also don't need megawatt power at those kind of locations anyway. But there are a lot of really good applications that a nuclear reactor can provide that sort of resilience that is necessary. And I think logistics are not sexy, but there are enough people in the Pentagon and Washington who recognize this need that has resurrected defense nuclear from a place it hasn't been at since the 60s.
Yeah, so let's dive into that even a little deeper. Maybe going back to World War II, Pacific Ocean. When I don't have my globe in front of me, when I spin that globe to show my son that one side of the Earth is essentially just a big ocean. So that war was fought by the U.S. And Japan, Home Island, and the surrounding islands. A long way to move fuel. So it seems like that's maybe one of the applications. And as you were saying, with near peer powers where they can send out submarines and ship and sink your oil tankers, that's a big deal. I mean, right now, I think we completely take for granted the freedom of navigation from U.S. naval hegemony, guaranteeing shipping lanes. And we have, we've speaking of economies of scale, I mean, we've scaled up our fuel tankers to just enormous sizes. That makes probably less sense in times of war in terms of a single point of weakness. The Chinese I think they just had a naval nuclear sub that just sunk on the dock, but presumably they are working on their subs. So yeah, tell me a little bit more about, I guess, historically, how hard it was to get fuel to the front in World War II and the Pacific War. And again, how this maybe strengthens the case for nuclear in that region as there is sort of a pivot to Asia.
Yeah, so the critical stat in the Pacific and World War II, that I find most interesting, is the one relating to the bombers that we sent over Tokyo. So when we would bomb mainland Japan, those bombers had to take off from fairly far into the Pacific in order to reach Tokyo. They'd take off from islands like Iwo Jima or the Philippines. And for every gallon of fuel that you would put in those planes for those missions, it was somewhere between 5 and 12 gallons of fuel that was required to get that 1 gallon in the fuel tank. And the reason for that is, first of all, that you had to move the fuel a long distance, but also that the Japanese were deliberately targeting our oil tankers. They were deliberately sinking them with their subs because they knew that was our weakness, was moving fuel across the Pacific. But if you look at now, not only would we potentially be going up against a foe with a much more capable submarine force, but also it's much harder for us to move fuel than it used to be. So you mentioned these gigantic ships that we now use to move fuel around, which are very easy targets. But even worse than that, these are not American ships. It's not that ExxonMobil is moving fossil fuels on U.S.-owned ships. The vast majority of fossil fuels that are moved by sea are owned by commodity firms. These are private companies that are just the middleman. And we have seen historically that these ships do not want to go anywhere near where wars happen. And they will screw over countries if it helps their bottom line. These are typically like European-based commodity firms. And as an example, when Speaker Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan a couple of years ago, and China decided to do some quote unquote exercises off the shore, the commodity ships that deliver natural gas did not deliver to Taiwan during that stress. Even though the odds of shooting were low, they just said, we have other people we can sell this to. We're not going to go through this. So if you look at the islands that the U.S. has west of Hawaii, so all those Western Pacific islands that we think about as being critical strategically, all of them receive their fossil fuels from the West. It comes from the Middle East and goes through the Malacca Strait and then goes to those islands on foreign flag ships. These are ships that are not going to be very helpful if any kind of shooting war happens. So our ability to get fossil fuels to these islands is going to be just a tremendous, tremendous challenge. And anytime this ever gets war gamed at the Pentagon, it's a huge problem. And so we're just starting to deal with this problem, but it is just going to be absolutely critical.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Even just looking historically, we're about to do another masterclass episode with Mark Nelson, this time on oil. And one of the many chapters in that book is Winston Churchill's decision as commander of the Navy, or I forget the exact term he had, to move from coal to oil, and just the logistical changes there in terms of your being energy secure, having that coal you can dig up in the UK and move to all these rain coaling sites, and then anyway all the challenges that went into moving over to using bunker fuel as a fuel source. The U.S. Army consumes more fossil fuels than many countries around the world. I think per year it's 250,000 barrels, and I think that's per year, not per day. But a good amount. And just speaking again of these commodities firms not wanting to risk their boats, I'm thinking of the Iran-Iraq war, where I can't remember if it was Saddam or the Iranians that started to sink oil tankers. Apparently, Reagan had to bail out the insurance industry because, again, this U.S. naval hegemony, the freedom of navigation, the kind of end of piracy, and these sorts of attacks meant that the ship companies were not paying a lot in insurance premiums. This was completely unanticipated. Like, it's amazing the sort of complacency we live in, given that the world has been globalized, and there's not been much in the way of near peer or even any sort of challenge to that naval hegemony. So we do live in interesting times. That Chinese saying, "May you live in interesting times," not necessarily a nice sentiment. But yeah, certainly I think you made a compelling case. I want to sort of shift gears and get a little bit into some of the nerdy technical details. So unless you have another thing to add there, I'd be happy to have it because I love talking military strategy. Why don't we jump into talking about what exactly this reactor is that you're building? I understand it's a high temperature gas reactor. I think it's a closed Brayton cycle, but yeah, let's kind of nerd out as much as you can on the technical specifications, and then we're going to talk probably about ML1 and the history, et cetera, of these various technologies up until now.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I am somewhat limited on what I could talk about with the design. We can't talk about specific materials, unfortunately, but we can talk a little bit. So yes, it's a triso-based reactor. We're using the AGR variant of triso. For those who know what that means, it's an already qualified nuclear fuel source. So this is one of those things where everyone can design a better fuel form, but trying to get nuclear fuel qualified for the regulators is a very expensive and slow process. So we want to use a variant that's already approved. Our triso is 19.75% enriched. It's HALEU fuel. It is a high temperature gas reactor. It is an open Brayton cycle, not a closed Brayton cycle.
Oh, it's open. Okay.
But yeah, so the secondary is air. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm just going to be awfully limited about what I can say about the system. But if people visualize a high temperature gas reactor, there's a lot of cartoons you could find that various companies have suggested, and those are reasonably accurate similes for what these systems look like.
And so, again, in terms of technology readiness level, from what I understand, rumor on the street is that TRISO was both kind of an opportunity and a constraint. This is a fuel that's very safe, that kind of has its own containment system built in. And that leads you to needing, I think, to use a high temperature reactor system. Is that true, first off? Are the rumors true that TRISO was sort of a must-have? And I'm guessing that has to do with some sort of kinetic factors. I don't know how much you can say, but I'll probe a little bit.
Yeah, so I did require AGR TRISO fuel. So when we had companies trying to design for this program, they had to design around the fuel. TRISO fuel is definitely very expensive. It is, I don't know if this phrase is old-fashioned now, but it's the Cadillac of fuels. That's what I call it. I don't know if the
Caviar
Cadillac anymore. So it is very expensive. But the main reason we chose it is actually not for the kinetic threat. I mean, it's definitely helpful for that. The fact that even if you were to suffer some sort of kinetic insult is the terminology for that, you would not have a total release of your fission product gases. But no, the real reason actually is that it eases your regulatory burden in quite a big way because you have this extra containment layer. And this is part of we've been able to leverage with the Department of Energy licensing. NRC licensing is pretty rigid in their approach, and the Department of Energy was willing to have a conversation with us about, well, okay, let's do a risk-driven analysis of what exactly are the threats here and what are the risks here. And to give an example of how we're able to leverage TRISO to reduce costs another way is earthquake resilience. So there is a seismic scale that goes from 1 to 5, and you don't need to get into it too technically, but nuclear reactors traditionally have to be 5. They have to be maximally earthquake resistant, so that basically no matter what earthquake can conceivably happen, that building is impregnable. Well, to do that requires an incredibly expensive civil engineering project. So the argument that we made to our regulators that actually we don't need our concrete structure to be earthquake proof. And in fact, if a terrible earthquake happened, the structure might collapse on the reactor. But that's okay. We still want to have radiation release, and here are the reasons why. And we do the analysis to demonstrate that. And then the regulators will likely say at the end of this that, yes, we concur with that approach. And so things like that can bring down a lot of your costs in other places. And that's kind of the give and take of TRISO. And you have to be smart about what sort of reactors are going to use TRISO, because it is so much more expensive to make the fuel. You need to make sure that you're saving that money somewhere else so that it's worth it.
I guess it also does constrain you, though, to reactor technologies that are at a lower technology readiness level. I think some people say, hey, why aren't you doing something like a scaled down naval reactor? The Russians have the academic Lomosov, which is basically, I think, either an icebreaker PWR or a nuke sub PWR that's put onto a barge. And there's probably reasons for that, but yeah, comment on that, because I guess, and to my sort of limited understanding, basically these TRISO fueled reactors, almost by definition, need to be high temperature. Like you can't really do a PWR running at 300 C with TRISO. It just doesn't make sense. It's not efficient. So your options, I guess, were molten salts, sodium fast reactor, and HTGR, and presumably you went for the one that had the highest TRL, or?
In regards to, we always get asked, well, why don't you guys just use a naval reactor? And so, first of all, the literal naval reactor design, besides the fact that those are classified and they're not going to want us to use those out in the open, those designs are also very expensive. The Navy has so many incredible performance requirements for their reactors that our reactors are not going to need. And so you don't want to have to pay for all of that performance. The naval reactors are the most amazing reactors in the world, but you pay for that.
And what exactly are you talking about? Is the ability to sort of like ramp from 0 to 100 and...
Yeah. So the ability to handle, off nominal conditions, if you're tilted a little bit, or being able to go from off to on really quick. There's just a lot of requirements that these naval ships have, because they need their reactors to operate all the time and under extreme conditions of warfare. So we just don't need that, and we don't want to pay for that. For TRISO, you wouldn't put in an LWR, because one of the big advantages of TRISO is that it can handle very, very high temperatures. So even this basic form of TRISO that we're using has been tested for 300 hours at 1800 degrees Celsius with no meaningful amount of breakage, which is extraordinarily hot. And if you look at some of the more advanced forms of TRISO that are not yet qualified, but which people are working on, can go even higher, maybe to like 2400, 2500 C. So for these advanced reactor concepts, part of the argument for going to non-light water reactors is that they can operate at higher temperatures, which A, allows you to have a more efficient reactor, but also B, allows you to have process heat if we're trying to decarbonize some of the industrial processes that need those really high heat. If you're going to operate at 300 C, then I wouldn't use TRISO either, because you're not using one of the main benefits of it. Oh, sorry. And sorry, you have one more question there, which was I actually didn't choose a high temperature gas reactor. So what we did is we opened it up to industry to pitch us on designs. We knew we didn't want a molten salt reactor, because that was going to be difficult from the transportability perspective, because molten salt freezes at room temperature. But in fact, when we were looking at 3 designs initially, only 2 of those designs are high temperature gas reactors. Our third competitor was Westinghouse, who was doing a heat pipe reactor. So we were open to other concepts. But if you look at what most of the advanced reactor companies are looking to do, even molten salt companies, almost all of them want to use TRISO. And it's for the safety benefits, the regulatory benefits, and the ability to operate at very high temperature.
Again, in terms of imagining, you've described it before, 4 shipping containers, kind of a reactor unit, a power conversion unit, et cetera. Trying to squeeze that into a really tight package is interesting. Um, Again, I thought it was really amazing, sort of time traveling and watching this short documentary the Army put out on the ML1, the Mobile Low Power 1 reactor, which was sort of a truck movable reactor. Really crazy stuff. I mean, essentially this closed Brayton cycle using nitrogen, I believe. It's cool just watching the video and hearing the thing like sounding like a jet turbine, which is what it is in the background. And seeing all of the mechanics and the nuts and bolts really gets you out of this sort of paper reactor world into seeing them messing around with it. 2 sort of big supporting facilities working on, the turbine side and the reactor side of the technology at different labs, I believe, around the country. Really fascinating. But yeah, talk a little bit more again about just the challenges of squeezing it into such a tight package. In our microreactor episode with Nick, we were talking about shielding challenges in particular. But yeah, help me understand again how the design choices to squeeze it in. I think I heard there was a potential of using supercritical CO2 at a certain point, and I understand that would maybe mean that your turbine could be a lot smaller. But as much as you can, walk us through, again, some of the design constraints and choices around just trying to get this thing into 4 shipping containers.
Yeah, I can tell you, we rejected supercritical CO2 because we thought the TRL levels were too low, to go back to earlier in the conversation. But yeah, getting everything into a small box is really difficult, and shielding is a big part of it. So if you look at like the 20-foot box that has the reactor in it, the core is a very small piece of that box. It's mostly shielding. Also, things like the intermediate heat exchanger, squeezing that into a box, that's also very difficult to do. But there's another piece to that, which I have found is woefully under talked about for these advanced reactor concepts, which is the material science and the thermal stresses on the system. That has probably been our biggest engineering challenge, and this is kind of under the category of when you go from paper reactors to real reactors, and you live the Rickover essay, and you learn that stuff that you weren't thinking that much about turned out to be really hard. And it turned out that actually the thermal stresses are a significantly more difficult challenge than the shielding. And the reason is because you could just actually visualize this, right? You have these very high temperatures, but then you have room temperature awfully close together. And that puts huge amounts of thermal strain on all these materials. And what we've also discovered, which is a little staggering to me, is that a lot of the models and codes that are even approved for reactors, these ASME codes, it turns out that they break down at these kind of temperature ranges. So we actually discovered a typo in the ASME code. We found that one of the models in the ASME code was off by a factor of 2, because until you actually put these thermal stresses on the real materials, you don't realize it. And so the materials that are used in traditional light water reactors have been used so many times that everyone has really good data. Everyone knows exactly how they're going to perform. And you can plug that into a code, and the code is going to tell you precisely how that material is going to behave. Whereas we found that actually these codes give you the entirely wrong answer in our conditions. And so this has been just our biggest challenge the last 6 to 12 months, has been dealing with thermal stresses. And so when I meet with some of these microreactor companies, like one of the first things I always ask them is, what are you guys doing on thermal stresses? Like, if you're not thinking about it now, you're making a big mistake, because it's just a really, really difficult challenge. And that's going to be the case for any microreactor, just because it's just a math problem. You have to get from very high temperature to room temperature in a very short distance. And it impacts your design in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, that's actually really fascinating. I hadn't had that on my laundry list of sort of some of the kind of fixed costs that increase at small scale. So yeah, in terms of the shielding, something I thought was interesting, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, is essentially this reactor is designed to pull up on a truck. I guess you're parking it within this concrete structure, which is, adding to some of the shielding. But you're also wanting to be able to turn it off and then move it, and then sort of bring it back and restart it. Just walk us through sort of, I guess this is all prototyping and testing, but it's going to be built out in Virginia by BWXT, move to INL, and just talk about that capacity you're trying to build in, because that does introduce obviously some complications trying to move a reactor that's actually been on, irradiated some fuel that's sitting there, and neutrons have activated stuff. So how do you work around a little bit of that? I mean, and this is all taking into account the famous, not the Turing test, but the Turan test, which is that the seriousness of a microreactor developer can be judged by the degree to which they show their shielding in their schematics. So shielding. Tell us about that and the requirements necessary, given that you plan on, putting this thing down, turning it on, taking it off, moving it, and then turning it back on somewhere else again.
As I think people know, once you turn off a reactor, you stop creating neutrons immediately. So what's going to kill you is going to be your secondary radiation, right? So you want to avoid stuff inside your system that's going to get irradiated by the reactor and is going to irradiate back at you. And so there's certain materials that, well, they'll be hot for initially, but they might have a 12-hour half-life, and you could just wait them out. But there's other materials, like to give an example of an obvious one is cobalt, right? If you have cobalt in your design, cobalt's half-life, I don't know what it is off the top of my head because, like I said, I'm not a professional nuclear engineer, but it's like a couple of years.
I think, 45
and
or
so
so.
if you get the cobalt hot, you're going to have a real problem moving anything. So when you're trying to design a tiny reactor, first of all, you have to knock down those neutrons as early as you possibly can. You have to really, really think in your design about how are you going to keep those neutrons as contained as you possibly can to minimize how much you do through secondary radiation. So that concrete structure I'm describing, that is not to knock down neutrons. We should be knocking down all the neutrons before that. That concrete structure is just for knocking down gammas. And that's really critical when you think about being able to use this in the real world, because if your concrete structure is knocking down neutrons, then you're going to have irradiated concrete, and now it's going to be very difficult to get rid of the concrete. Whereas concrete that's irradiated by gammas, that doesn't cause secondary radiation. So among the ways that we're going to be knocking down the neutrons, which is actually a repeat of the way the Army did it back in the day, which is to put water around the reactor. Because that's something where you can just have empty water containers and then fill them with distilled water when you get to the site. And water is very good at knocking neutrons down. Although even in that case, just in case someone's trying to design a reactor off of what I'm saying, keep in mind that impurities in water, make sure about if you're creating tritium or other things, you do have to monitor that. It's not trivial, but it's the most obvious way to do it and to keep your weight down. Because we're trying to keep this system light enough that it can fly in a C-17 as a regular weight load, which puts extreme weight limits. And, nuclear shielding is a physics problem. There's no magical solution to high Z materials. And shielding is just very heavy. And so finding stuff that you can do locally that will provide that shielding is going to be critical if you're going to be able to move this thing in planes, let alone, cars and trucks over bridges and under tunnels.
So as little lead as possible, borated polyethylene. I'm probably getting that polymer wrong, but that stuff's, the lead is heavy. The borated whatever is a bit lighter, I'm guessing. A question that comes up for me with shielding and microreactors is, you got to get in and maintain these things. It sounds like you're putting the power conversion system in another area. That should be rad safe because it's on a secondary loop. I guess the heat exchanger is going to have, radioactive stuff hitting it. Helium's not going to carry a lot, unless there's some, fuel failures or things like that. But in terms of getting in and operating reactors, high temperature gas reactors, has to be acknowledged they've been pretty buggy. Capacity factors at Fort St. Vrain, famously like 16%. Peach Bottom a bit better. But it's generally been, from what I understand, talking to some Germans that ran high temperature gas reactors, like it was white knuckles. Like, yes, you get up to 50% capacity factor, but like you're, sweating bullets, keeping that reactor going, doing a lot of troubleshooting. So obviously there's going to be improvements that are made. This only happens through prototyping and experience like you're doing. But if you got to go in and tweak that reactor and torque some wrenches or whatever else it is, in my very uneducated idea of what maintaining a reactor looks like, how does that interplay with the shielding challenge? Because everything's so much tighter.
Yeah. So, when I started on Pele, we want to see, well, okay, let's see what designs are out there for microreactors. And most commonly, you look at a cartoon on the internet of a microreactor concept, they usually put the whole system inside one box. And in fact, the Defense Science Board report in 2016 that got all this started, the microreactor they analyzed was a 40-foot container that had the whole system in it. And one of the first decisions I made on Pele was to get rid of that. And there's several reasons. But if you have your whole reactor system inside one box, you're going to have two really big problems. First of all, your reactor is going to be putting out a ton of neutrons, which are going to beat on, like your turbine blades are going to be getting blasted with high energy neutrons. It's probably going to break really fast. It's also going to become really radioactive. But also, if you want to do maintenance, how are you going to get into that thing? right? Everyone's gonna have to dress up like an extra from Chernobyl in order to get in and do daily maintenance. Because when you look at what is the maintenance going to be on a nuclear reactor, it's not really going to be on the reactor part. There's very few moving parts there. Your maintenance is going to be anywhere you have a bunch of pieces of metal that spin really fast next to each other. That's where things break down, your bearings and gears and stuff like that. So we decided really early on that rather than try to put everything in a 40-foot box, we were going to put things in separate 20-foot boxes. And so that allows us to provide significant amount of shielding between the reactor and the power conversion module, but it also is going to make the maintenance easier. Now, that said, Pele is the first of a kind, and it's not a fully optimized system. So our maintenance is still going to be a bit of a pain, in part because we have to be really cautious, because on a first of a kind, you can model what you think is going to happen inside that reactor, but you might be off. So we have to be wary about, hey, there might be little bits of dust that are inside that concrete module. What happens if they get activated? You might breathe it in, And so we're going to have to be very cautious, but that's one of the benefits of doing this prototype at Idaho National Laboratories, that they have experience dealing with this. We like to point out that Idaho National Lab will literally, as an exercise, they will spray radioactive stuff outside in the desert with very short half-lives so that they could practice radiological releases. So they know how to handle this stuff and how to deal with it. But this is, I know I'm repeating myself, but this is part of the why you got to get to the second of a kind, third of a kind, fourth of a kind, till you have something that actually is efficient enough and that you can maintain properly enough that it can be really useful for the DoD.
And again, this is where I think your frank acknowledgement that like this is a science experiment. It has an application. You're eager to get to that point of application. And again, not necessarily commercial viability, but military strategic viability, I think is really important, because when you're talking about first of a kind and you're, getting venture capital funds and you're hoping to provide that return to your investors, it's hard to, I think, be upfront and maybe honest about the fact that, hey, this is going to take some tweaking. It took us like 3 or 4 decades to get up to the capacity factors of our current fleet with technology that's probably a little bit easier, certainly more technology ready. I think one of the issues that really plagues nuclear in terms of discussions with policymakers and the general public is category errors. And they just happen all the time. In microreactors, hey, they're just diesel generators. Or even worse, they're just a nuclear battery. Just kind of walk away from it. We've already talked about a few reasons. I think we're starting to see that delta between, the differences between a diesel generator or a battery and a nuclear reactor, talking about shielding, talking about expensive fuel. Operations is certainly a thing. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands, millions of mechanics that can go in and troubleshoot and fix a diesel genset. One of the things that I think contributed to really hurting the Army nuclear power program was the amount of maintenance. I heard one of the microreactors had a team of 25. I'm not sure if those 25 operators had to be on all the time, but you had active cooling systems. You had a lot going on. I was looking at, again, this great documentary on mobile low power 1 reactor, the previous sort of truck-based reactor. I think they just had 4 guys working on it. Process control operator. Interesting, like doing the health physics work of like, okay, we got to do some work on the reactor, guys. Let's plan the dosing. Let's keep this all safe. Let's put up the little ribbon, 500 yards around the reactor where no one will go by to get a dose. Like, again, and this sort of like, maybe the simplistic nuke bro world of like, oh man, L&T is BS and Alara, whatever, it's kind of an overreaction to the radiophobia we've had. I think there's been a lack of respect for that diatribe on the side, but you had also like, I think operating mechanic, electrician, back, they were a little less politically correct than a operator instrument man. So what are we looking at in terms of the HR requirements for running this thing?
In terms of personnel, I mean, we don't fully know. I don't want to give you a number that turns out to be wrong. But certainly while we have as a DoD left radioisotope generators unaccompanied in the Arctic, that has been done, I don't think anyone is going to allow an unaccompanied nuclear fission reactor anytime soon. I like to compare reactors to self-driving cars in that we basically have self-driving cars now, but no one allows a car to go on highways without a driver sitting there at the wheel. And so our Pele reactor is going to be automated. It's going to be mostly fully automated. But even so, at all times, we're going to have 2 people sitting in the operating box able to take action if something goes wrong. And it's going to be that way for a while. To your point about categories, I mean, we can't even agree on what the definition of a microreactor is or what an SMR is. And we literally had a meeting in the White House Situation Room about 5 years ago where we got a bunch of undersecretaries in the room. We tried to say, okay, once and for all, the United States is going to define what an SMR is and what a microreactor is. And we concluded that there was no conclusion. No one could agree. So no one knows what these terms mean. And yeah, I do get irritated by the term nuclear battery because to me, nuclear battery implies a radioisotope generator, which is very different. We try to remind people that, the largest radioisotope ever made was like 1.1 kilowatt, maybe. So you're not going to have a megawatt nuclear battery if we don't have the material on Earth. When people try to your example, try to say, oh, nuclear reactor is just like a diesel generator. And not only is that wrong because it's not like a diesel generator, but also you're self-limiting yourself if all you're doing is dropping in reactors for diesel generators. The advantage of a nuclear reactor for the DoD is that you could do things that you couldn't do before, right? So the naval nuclear program isn't just taking a 1940 sub and putting a reactor in to replace the batteries. They completely redesigned the nuclear submarine about what those capabilities were. And so we really need to be thinking bigger than just replacing diesel gensets with nuclear reactors.
In terms of another area, and again, these are all what I'm probably using the wrong term. Like they're not necessarily fixed costs in terms of the cost not being able to be brought down, but every reactor, no matter how big or small, Nick Trent did a great job talking about Fermi Pile 1 that was a 2-watt reactor. Didn't need shielding, but still was dosing the room at like 30 millisieverts a second. One going up to CP2, 2 kilowatts, 2 toaster ovens worth of output, 300 millisieverts, like enough to kill people with acute radiation syndrome. So 5 feet concrete walls just around a 2 kilowatt reactor. But hey, a gigawatt scale reactor also needs 5 feet. So you have these fixed items, shielding, fuel, which gets a little more expensive as we get smaller because of neutron economy, operations and maintenance. And, this is just basic economies of scale. When you get bigger, that's a smaller relative cost. It might be absolute similar cost, but it becomes smaller as we go. When I hear about like, okay, we're going to power this data center with, 110 megawatt microreactors, I go, okay, so I'm going to refuel and handle fuel out of a LWR, which is not easy, but it's much easier. And I'm going to do that once every 3 to 5 years, depending on what fuel I'm using, et cetera. Or I'm going to refuel 110 megawatt reactors. And maybe they've got HALEU, maybe they run for 10 years, but still, that's an extraordinary amount of work. There's a ton of complexity that goes into it, particularly with reactors that are not water cooled. So walk me through a little bit of the approach in terms of refueling this, because I think that kind of gets, again, blustered over. And again, partially it's this, unsophisticated nuke bro thing of, hey, nuclear waste is not a big deal. Don't worry about it. My talking point is that it's, there's the paradox. It is one of the most insanely dangerous things on the planet, yet it hasn't harmed anyone, but it's because we make dangerous things safe. Easier to do in a water-based system. So tell me a little bit about the approach here with Pele. Are you refueling in the field, for instance? What's the plan?
Well, Pele 1.0 is actually not going to be refueled at all. We have done a lot of trade studies on refueling and what the right way to do that. It actually ends up being driven by your transportation requirements and about how you're going to get that waste back. Because typically nuclear waste in the United States is moved by rail. And if you can only use these reactors where there's rail spurs, you're really limited. So if you want to be able to have reactors that can operate off grid and be somewhere where they can only go by road, you need to make sure that you could transport that waste back, over bridges and under tunnels and things like that. I do think the smaller reactors will gain some efficiency from getting into nth of a kind world, right? Like, being able to automate processes. There should be some things that you could do cheaper. But yes, to your point, there's just some physics reasons why microreactors will always be less efficient than bigger reactors. And they're always going to be more expensive on a per kilowatt hour basis than a gigawatt reactor. And so I don't think anyone's going to make a 20 cents a kilowatt hour microreactor anytime soon, whereas obviously large reactors can operate much cheaper than that. And so that's why the use for microreactors is not going to be tying 100 of them together to power a data center. That would be asinine. The use of microreactors should only be in places where you're already paying high electricity prices because you're already in a difficult location. So think about the Arctic, Alaska, islands, places where you're not going to be able to build a gigawatt nuclear power plant, and where they're already paying In much of Alaska, they're already paying over 40 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity. If you've ever been to Alaska, right near Juneau, they have hydropower. Electricity is very cheap, but everyone that's not connected to that pays really high prices. And if you look on the islands Pacific, Hawaii is already close to 40 cents a kilowatt hour, and some of the islands are worse than that. So in those cases, I don't need the microreactor to be worth 20 cents a kilowatt hour for it to be useful. If it's even 40 cents a kilowatt hour, there's a lot of demand for those sorts of microreactors. So you got to really target it to places that are willing to pay those sorts of prices. Now, you want to power a data center. I wouldn't power a data center with one reactor because, and this is kind of where SMRs come in, right? Because any reactor is going to have some maintenance time. So, depending on that reactor, 24/7, 365 is going to be dicey. So, being able to meet that with a few, like 100 megawatt SMRs, that makes a lot of sense to me. But yeah, trying to tie together a bunch of microreactors somewhere in the contiguous 48 states is never going to make any economic sense. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big old fan of grid power in the end for those applications, but that's going to take a lot of careful negotiating with FERC and grid managers, et cetera. It is funny. I mean, even just you saying, listen, as it's just kind of basic laws of physics, economies of scale are real. Like, I feel like we've been so gaslit in the last 10 or 15 years. Like, I get a little lump in my stomach when I say things like this. I know them to be true, but I feel like I've been convinced that I'm crazy for thinking, this heretical thought that economies of scale are real, and perhaps like real in no other environment more so than nuclear. Again, because of these fixed costs or inalienable, needs that nuclear reactors have versus, say, diesel generators and other forms of technology. It really is a strange moment we live in. And I think back sort of to that nuclear renaissance you're referencing in the early 2000s when this stuff was, in terms of the SMR hype was really not there. There were thoughts about, okay, we need to find, for small grids or whatever. But I mean, it is really interesting how things have changed so much. I guess just kind of moving into our closing up phase here, getting back into sort of grand strategy. What are sort of these peer potential adversary nations doing? What do we know in terms of their programs? I mean, I haven't heard of much microreactor development out of China and Russia. Maybe they're a bit more secret about it. Certainly, they're looking at, I think, larger systems like 40 to 100 megawatt scale in Russia and China. But what's our understanding of kind of where peer, we'll call them potential adversary nations, are at?
Yeah, I'm going to answer this question carefully
I love
because
it.
you want to make sure not to go anywhere near what's classified here. But what you may have heard, it's one thing if you're a presidential candidate, you can get away with that stuff, but not the hoi polloi. You may have heard that China discovered a bunch of new islands in the South China Sea, and it turns out they're all historic China property. Who knew? And they have actually very similar challenges to what we have in the Pacific, which is that those islands are expected to power these very energy-hungry military bases that are on those islands. And so the Chinese have, very publicly been exploring. I think they've been focused more on reactors on a boat rather than microreactors, but they are doing some microreactor work as well. So they've definitely been thinking about it, about what their solution is going to be here. Because trying to run electricity from mainland to islands is difficult for a couple reasons. One is it's just very expensive to run big power cables across the ocean, but also those then become super easy to cut. Certainly these countries are putting money behind this and trying to figure this out. The Russians have kind of been, they're kind of busy with what they're doing in Ukraine right now. So they talk a big game about what they're doing with advanced nuclear, but we haven't seen a lot of movement on that in the last few years.
Good answer. Good answer. Well played. I love asking awkward questions to people with serious security constraints. But this does raise an interesting question. I feel like China is the place where decarbonization dreamers can go to see the sort of world of the future potentially. They're just so far ahead of us in terms of nuclear, even advanced nuclear in terms of, pebble bed, high temperature gas reactors. I think they're working on molten salt reactors, the deployment of electric vehicles, blah, blah, blah. But like, why not do Pele on a boat? Like, if one of the important theaters is, say, Pacific Islands, in the context of moving that fuel all the way out there, Guam, for instance, wouldn't it be also sort of like in terms of siting, like you need local permissions? Like a land-based reactor seems like a big headache. Why? Like, I guess if you really need to get somewhere inland, you might want something that you put on a truck. But yeah, why not just put this thing on a barge or a boat? I'm
So
sure
I
you've.
love the idea of putting a reactor on a boat. And in fact, I think there are certain applications that the US has in the DoD that would be ideal for nuclear reactors on a boat. So for the first of a kind, we simply had to set one set of technical requirements that we want to build to. And what we've tried to build is actually pretty much the hardest thing you could try to do, which is to build a reactor that fits on a C-17. Because our feeling is if we could do this, then putting a reactor on a boat's an easier problem. So let's try to do the most difficult practical thing that we can do. And then if what the DoD decides to do next is, well, hey, great, Pele is great, but we want to adapt it to make it a 30 megawatt system that's on a boat. Okay, that's easier than what we already did. We should be able to do that without too much difficulty.
I had a sensei that once said, "Cry in the dojo, laugh on the battlefield."
That's a good one. I like that.
That sounds like what you're up to, setting a high challenge to start.
Crying the dojo is a good way to describe building reactors.
Yeah, what you're going through right now, for sure. Well, happy to provide some decouple therapy, chance for you to sort of talk it all out in a supportive environment, Jeff. This has been a real blast, man, and it's such a treat. Again, it feels like a lot of these technologies are sort of out in the vaporware universe. And so seeing something that's actually getting done, getting built, getting tested, prototypes, and being able to speak with someone who's so knowledgeable about it, really where sort of theory meets reality in 3D is such a great opportunity. So, Jeff, thank you for joining the illustrious list of Decouple guests. And I hope to be able to check in with you, in like a year or two, and hopefully things are moving as quickly as they have been so far.
No, thanks. It's a great conversation. I'm glad the internet held up for the whole hour this time. So that's good. No, I really appreciate it. And that was a lot of fun.
All the best, Jeff. Bye for now.